Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Starting off with my word count update for the week of August 12th through the 18th, I wrote a total of 1,379 words, which brings the project total up to 51,519 words. That is still not quite as much as I'd like to accomplish in a week, obviously, but it is more than last week, and it is more than zero. So I'll take the victories I can get. Our main topic today, I have the sword back, is characters. What are they? Who are they? What do they know? Let's find out. Characters are obviously the people or animals or other living things that people come up with in a story that do stuff. You can obviously have humans, animals, aliens, whatever you want as a character. Regardless of whatever characters actually exist in your story, the important things that you'll have in place for them are roles and archetypes. And that's where I wanted to start off this character lesson. A character role is something like protagonist and antagonist. There are technically additional labels for character roles such as deuteragonist and tritagonist, but those are largely holdovers from Greek dramas and nobody really uses them anymore. So protagonist and antagonist, or more broadly, main character and secondary character, is what you'll probably hear more often these days. Now, how you determine who fits into a main character category versus secondary character is obviously up to you. It's a little superfluous overall, but from my general perspective, I would say that anyone with a point of view that continues throughout the whole story would count as a main character. The antagonist or multiple antagonists can certainly be a main character or a secondary character, but your protagonist will always be a main character, because protagonist is the role that we follow throughout the story. A fundamental role of the protagonist is both progressing the plot and facing the most significant challenges throughout the story. In general, the shorter your story, the fewer characters you'll actually have. That means that a short story probably won't have much more than one actual main character, whereas a sprawling epic fantasy might have like a dozen main characters. In my opinion, with a very large story, there's no need to limit yourself to only one protagonist if you would like to shoot for more of an ensemble cast. Now, I also like to draw this distinction between protagonist and hero, antagonist and villain. The former in both of these pairs is a role, whereas the latter is an archetype. A story can absolutely follow a villainous protagonist, or a story could have a heroic antagonist. Now you may be thinking, but gee Brandon, what is a character archetype? And boy golly, I'm glad you asked. In storytelling, archetypes don't just refer to characters, but also plot elements, themes, settings, and so on. Basically, archetypes are notably repeated throughout our experiences with stories. To be clear though, that repetition is actually a good thing, because archetypes create a sense of familiarity that allows a reader to immediately relate to a specific character based on the experiences that the reader brings to the table with that established archetype. You may have heard at some point in your life about the 12 or 14 or 80 or whatever literary archetypes, so just know that there isn't really a clear consensus on the upper limit of character archetypes. You can probably come up with hundreds. Some common examples of character archetypes would include like the wise mentor, the reluctant hero, the disguised stranger, the wandering bard, bonus points if they have a troubled past, and so on. The reason we see these archetypes throughout storytelling is because they resonate with readers. The main caveat though is that you don't want your archetypal characters to become cliches or stereotypes, unless your story can actually make good use of those things. For example, the gruff and tough drill sergeant is a perfectly fine side character to push the protagonist forward at a certain point in the story. However, that same drill sergeant character might not make a good protagonist because they might come off as a more boring character throughout the entirety of a story. The main takeaway here is that an archetype speaks to a relatable experience while presenting something new and unique, but that doesn't need to be particularly complicated. Gandalf, for example, is a prime example of a wise mentor figure, but he has some endearing traits such as his love of the hobbits and their tobacco, which makes him stand out as not just being kind of a stereotypical wizard. Building on all of that, let's talk about what makes characters stand out. But first, I will say that this is once again a loaded question, and everyone's answers will differ. This very short list here is more of an aggregate of my thoughts on it and things I've seen online, but as always, this is not meant to be comprehensive or authoritative. I have boiled my list down to 3 concepts: relatability, likability, and competency. Characters who have relatable motivations and goals usually resonate with readers more strongly than characters with loftier, grander ambitions, particularly at the beginning of a story. One of the most common pieces of advice that you'll see for new writers that's actually good is to make sure you establish your protagonist's motivation in chapter 1. It's important to know what the character wants out of life, whether that's something bigger than their normal life or just something within their normal life, because stories are largely about disrupting the main character's life. Part of the fun of reading is seeing how those disruptions then propel or hinder the character as they move toward their goals. But you definitely want to start small. A character whose immediate motivation is to save the world isn't exactly relatable. A character who works a dead-end job to pay the bills and just wants life to be a little better is totally relatable. Because unfortunately, most people have had to work jobs that they don't like or want because we still have to pay our bills, eat food, etc. And I would argue that this is applicable regardless of genre. In epic fantasy specifically, stories tend to grow in scope to have relatively large consequences, whether for a nation or the entire world, but our protagonists very rarely ever start off with that goal in mind, and instead begin in their regular lives prior to the disruption that's coming. For example, in The Broken God, two of the main characters are brothers named Rensler and Luca. They do start off in a relatively remote village, which is an epic fantasy staple, but they are not farmers. On one hand, we have Luca, who is thoroughly bored of the mundane life of the countryside, and then we have Rensler, who is the older brother and wishes life could be even more mundane. Rensler is the elder sibling in this relationship, so he wants to protect his younger brother from basically everything. Both of their initial motivations not only impact the way that they respond to the inciting incident, but also continue to shape how they process change throughout the entire story. As with archetypes, relatability doesn't have to be super complicated, and realistically, I just draw off of my own life experiences when I'm starting to kind of ideate a character. Luca's desire to see the world is exactly how I felt when I started reading epic fantasy as a young lad. Rensler's desire to protect his younger brother, no matter what, is how I felt when I got older and started working in education. These two characters really just represent fundamental pieces of myself at different times of my life, and I feel safe in assuming that these are relatable motivations for a lot of people. On to Likeability. Likeability might be the most varied concept here because every single person has a different idea of what they like about other people, if they like other people. However, there are some very easy ways to establish whether the audience should like or dislike a character right off the jump. Common cliches for building up likability is having a character on screen pretty early on comfort a crying child and stop to pet a cat. And yes, those are things that make me sympathetic toward a character. And then you have the flip side of establishing somebody who's a little bit more nefarious. A character who comes on screen and immediately knocks an ice cream cone out of a kid's hand and then kicks a puppy probably won't be liked. The main challenge for establishing likability is to remember that the character doesn't need to be a paragon of virtue to be liked. A character can both comfort a child and pet a cat and then go cheat on his wife. Whether we still like that character might actually depend on how the wife's character is created. Maybe she's completely awful to him and he feels like he deserves to have a better relationship. Maybe she's amazing and he's a total jerk. It's really just up to you as the writer to determine how you want your characters to be. But I will say the more depth you can give a character, the more relatable they're going to be, and the more potential they have to be likable. My final note on likability though is that you can actually go in the complete opposite direction and make the most despicable character you want. Think Joffrey and Cersei from Game of Thrones as incredibly popular examples of this. I caution against making a protagonist this way though, because it's much more difficult for people to relate with a character who only exhibits cruelty, but a protagonist definitely can start off as unlikable and become likable throughout the story. I would just say you wouldn't want a protagonist to remain unlikable. Finally, we have competency. Extreme competency can absolutely make up for a lack of likability, though I caution that becomes harder the longer the story goes on. A prime example of this is Benedict Cumberbatch in Sherlock. I enjoyed the heck out of that show in the first couple seasons because that iteration of Sherlock, while fairly unlikable as a person, was extremely competent. Unfortunately, as the show went on, his competency kind of became borderline magical, which just really took me out of the show. And you see that happen when you have a show that's positioned as having a relative sense of believability. Once that believability wanes, we start to lose interest. I don't have too much to say about competency because I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but I will say if you have a hyper-competent character, just make sure they have some kind of flaw or gap in their knowledge to kind of balance out and make sure that they're not always the smartest character in the room. Now, the bonus category is proactivity. A character who is proactive will generally stand out more than a character who is reactive. Proactivity means that the character is the one who is driving the things that are happening in the story. Both protagonists and antagonists, main characters and secondary characters, can all be proactive. In fact, a story generally relies on some measure of proactivity from both your protagonist and your antagonist. It's generally more interesting for a character to make decisions and deal with the consequences, both good and bad, and not only react to things as they happen to them. Granted, this is not a hard and fast rule, and there should be some measure of give and take between proactivity and reactivity, because your protagonist will do a thing which makes the antagonist react to that. Then your antagonist will do a thing that makes your protagonist react to that. So that kind of give and take back and forth is essential for a story. But on the whole, I think it behooves you to have a more proactive than reactive protagonist. To wrap this all up, I want to point out that for new and inexperienced writers, it is perfectly fine to draw on your favorite characters and essentially insert them into your story. I don't think you should do that all the time, but I think it's okay if you're looking for a particular role that you need to fill and you have a character that you like from a different piece of media, just basically copy and paste and put them in. If you need a wacky comic relief character, have Captain Spack Jarrow show up. If you need a wise wizard, have Randolph the Red show up. Most things that you write in the learning years where you're really developing your skills will never see the light of day, so just have fun with it. Yes, it will still be difficult, and yes, creating compelling characters is still hard work. I'm constantly second-guessing basically every single scene I write because I'm concerned that readers won't care about the characters. But that's all part of the process, and that's what reader feedback is for when you're finally ready for it. That's it for today. As always, thanks for stopping by. If you liked the video, please like the video, and consider subscribing to the channel if you'd like to continue along with my writing lessons and my own writing journey. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you here in the next video.